Oh, hello there, friend. It's so good to be back for season 2 of the podcast space. I'm very excited to be revealing all the things that we're going to be talking on season 2 of the podcast space, and also what happened in between season 1 and season 2, because I always get asked, what would happen if I was to not promote my podcast at all, Anna? What would be the impact on my downloads, on my traffic, on my retention, on my brand, on my social media? You see where I'm going, right? So I wanted to create a season preview about what the new season will be about, but really telling you a little bit about what happens in between, what you can expect if you do that, and also how you can avoid having 0 downloads on that dashboard, which I think is probably one of the most traumatic things as a podcaster, to put all of these time and effort into a show and then realizing that, it's not getting any listeners. So I want to be talking about exactly those two things, and also reveal a few big things that you may have not heard if you don't follow me on Instagram. By the way, I'm at the podcast space, THE podcast as a singular word, and then space. Because yes, some big life changes had to happen on this side, and it's going to affect how season 2 and a lot of the strategic content was based on these decisions. If you're new here, hello, I'm an Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space. I'm an award-winning marketer that teaches impact-driven podcasters and entrepreneurs how to use the show in a way that is meaningful and helps them get more visibility in the online space, which you all need, in the offline world too, because the impact of a podcast is never just measured by the online impact. So what happens if you decide to not promote the podcast at all? Well, I kind of cheated because I promoted the podcast one time on a newsletter, and that was it. So for almost 3 months, I didn't promote a podcast on social media or on my newsletter, apart from that one time. And what happened? Well, I looked at the data right before recording these episodes, because I'm releasing this on International Podcast Day, which is September 30th. And here's what I found out. The first thing is that there was a shift in platform use. You may have seen it in the news, and I shared that on social media, that there's been a growth on Spotify users overall, even here in the US. In Europe, it's quite normal because not everyone has an iPhone, so most people tend to use an Android, and what most people use on an Android is also Spotify. Now, because I am based in the US, the audience that I serve tends to be more users of Apple devices. That was an interesting change, which made me believe that users are shifting their behaviors. And again, Spotify is launching a lot of new features, so it kind of makes sense. But it's quite curious, and you should totally check your podcast as well to see if you notice that trend. So I looked at that almost a 90-day period and compared it to the previous 90-day period, because I couldn't compare it to the previous year because I had what I call like a surge in bot activity. So basically all of these bots on the internet played my podcast, which is something that I covered on another episode, and I can include the link in the show notes so you can listen. But it was something that I just could not look at the data. And again, we look at data here and we break it down into useful and practical advice. And the data was not usable. So of course I had to use something else. So I compared it to the previous section, which is, again, when I released content. And so looking into the audio data, I was really surprised to see the amount of downloads that I got out of not promoting it at all. It wasn't 0. It was 30% of what I normally get when I actively promote a podcast and when I release content. And I thought it was really interesting because it was not only 30% of the downloads, it was also 30% of the unique listeners, which this number really varies depending on the season that you're at. And then when looking at video, I thought that was going to be minimally impacted because I normally promote the audio episodes more than YouTube, so it just made more sense. I had a 30% lower than average view duration, so basically it was new traffic unfamiliar with who I am and my content. Then I had 40% less views in comparison to the same 90 days before, which was, again, no active promotion. So it's YouTube doing its thing. And it was really interesting because I looked into the traffic sources and Google, which kind of confirms what I always say, which is you can get listenership that can come from newsletters that is like part of your welcome sequence. So basically the podcast is integrated in my email marketing welcome sequence. So if you sign up to the Podcast Spaces newsletter, you will receive at some point a link that promotes a podcast, right? So that's passively happening. And then the pages, they are heavily SEO optimized and that were already getting me traffic to the website continue doing the same. So basically, I know that those pages where I embedded specific episodes, and again, I track, that's something that I teach you as well, like how do you leverage what's already working so you don't have to constantly be reinventing the wheel. A ton of Google traffic, a ton of new traffic, word of mouth, and then podcast interviews, because I did a few in these period. All of them contributed to that 30% of what normally is my normal downloads. And in terms of consumption, there was an impact in the consumption. So basically, people were not listening in as much of the episode as per usual, which is normal for what we say, air quotes, cold traffic. Now, I thought it was really interesting. A few other things that happened in between was that the podcast actually showed inactive on some platforms. So if I had someone looking for a sponsorship for the podcast space or something like that, or someone that is researching for strategic partners or something like that, they may want active podcasters. And also as a listener, if you're looking for new shows to add to your weekly playlist, maybe you are not as excited to add a podcast that may show as inactive or at least not as updated from some platforms that show that information. And let me tell you, I continue to receive endless pitches that were all terrible. They were so bad. They were like, me. I want to be on your show. And when clearly I haven't featured a guest in a very long time. So I thought it was kind of silly. So everybody do your homework, right? Because it just, as someone who is pitched all the time, I just see the really lazy pitches. And if you're struggling to convert the pitches you're sending to shows, there may be one reason. So it sounds very generic and it shows you didn't even do the homework. So pay attention. Just as a reminder, I feel like a lot of podcasters do the show because they cannot create content. They're like, I can't imagine what I would be talking about on my social media or my newsletter. And that's something that I don't have any problems with. The podcast is actually just one of those things that I add to my list, but I can have no issues creating social media content, video, graphics, and I can totally write a newsletter every single week. And that's not a problem for me. For many podcasters, stopping seasons means that they have to maybe recycle content because they're like just can't get themselves around the idea of diving into creation without that meaty episode beforehand. So let's move into the exciting things. On Instagram, I shared that there were some major news that were having an impact in how I was going to release this season. Initially, I expected to release about 20 episodes and incorporate some interviews, but I decided against it because I'm moving to Bentonville, Arkansas from Dallas, Texas. I'm currently in Dallas and my husband's job is moving us there. So life happens. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to pre-record all of the content in my office so that I know, what the space looks like. The look is consistent. The audio is consistent. I don't have to stress out on what it will look like and sound like and how I can lit it up. The topic of the season is going to be the 3 M's, the marketing, metrics, and mindset. All of these are 3 very, very important things. They are correlated more than you think. And when I am coaching and consulting with clients, there's always at some point in our engagement a moment when I notice that they really would benefit from a mindset shift, or they're not measuring enough, or they're not measuring the right things, or they're not marketing it in a way that feels good to them. This podcast series is going to be strategic to help you get around some limiting beliefs, to bring awareness into some issues that you may not have noticed, or kind of like guide you into understanding that maybe you need coaching or maybe you need consulting. Nothing is wrong with you or your show. And a few things that we're going to be covering: how to passively attract and convert listeners to your show through your podcast's profile. 3 podcast metrics that every business owner needs to track in order to grow their podcast. And no, it isn't downloads. And also, how limiting beliefs can affect podcast and business opportunities and what to do instead. This is such a big one. I see so many people that have amazing concepts, amazing shows, and these beliefs are really completely limiting their potential and their show's potential. It's going to be 10 episodes, as I said. You can sign up to the Podcast Spaces newsletter and receive those on your inbox because I have an RSS automation to remind you to listen to the show. Now, I'm very excited because we're going to be expanding how the podcast space looks, feels on the user experience side. So if you go to the podcast space's website, you'll see segmentation. Again, this will be like a multi-quarter process, but basically if you are an independent podcaster, if you are a business owner, or if you are an agency, which is my secondary audience, you'll be able to really have more customized experience. Same thing for the newsletter. And that is very exciting because it's just going to help everybody who's looking for specific support to find it faster. And again, the podcast space has been on as a business since 2020. And hey, it's my first business. So of course, there will be some pivoting and a lot of learning and a lot of growth, and especially more interactive growth. So if you're listening and you are an agency owner, there'll be a lot of opportunities for you to collaborate with the podcast space. And I'll be talking about that in future episodes. But I wanted to keep this first preview exciting, give you some insights into what happens when you market, when you don't market a podcast, what you look at, and in terms of trends and all. I want to invite you to visit thepodcastspace.com if you need customized support to help you grow because you feel like you're spinning your wheels and podcasting feels lonely. And so at some point, we all need outside perspective to grow the show. You can book your 30-minute call with me. I'll leave the link in the show notes. Connect with me on Instagram if that feels less scary than sending an email. And so the new episode is going to be dropping on October 2nd. Same time, same day. And I just invite you, as always, to keep creating imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.